The world can be a very mysterious place, full of unexplained artifacts, unsolved disappearances, and crimes that seem completely unsolvable. Throughout history, experts have encountered strange events that seem to defy any plausible explanation, and each year many more of these mysteries are added to the list. Number 10. Black Jack Ketchum, whose real name was Thomas Edward Ketchum, was an outlaw who was born in San Saba County, Texas in 1863. He carried out many of his misdeeds with his brother Sam, who in 1890 accompanied him to the Pecos River Valley in New Mexico, where they landed jobs as cowboys. They relocated to that area at the time when the railroads were being built, and it was a lucrative time for outlaws, as money was often conveyed via the trains with only minimal security, making them an easy target for a quick payday. It would certainly have been a much easier job than being a cowboy, and before long the two brothers convinced their newly acquired friends to leave honest labor behind in favor of a life as train robbers. Jack and Sam had pulled off a few train robberies in Texas, so they quickly informed their gang of what to expect. They carried out their first heist just outside of Nutt in New Mexico, making off with a good deal of money according to most sources. The two brothers were not to be underestimated, as was evidenced by an incident that took place on the 13th of June that year. On the 12th, Jack and Sam arrived in Liberty and were offered a room by a store owner, who upon waking the next day found that his store had been robbed and the two brothers were missing. The alarm was raised and a group of 4 men set out to find the culprits, but when they did, they immediately regretted it. During a confrontation at the Plaza Largo Arroyo, 2 of the men were quickly dispatched by the brothers, and the remaining 2 fled to alert the authorities. But even with their identities known, they were never arrested. But not every heist went as planned. The gang, which was now known as the Hole in the Wall Gang, decided to carry out another robbery at Twin Mountain, but Jack wasn't present during the job, and Sam was arrested after he was injured. He lost his life while in custody, but this did little to deter Jack from a life of crime. Instead, he decided to rob yet another train on the 16th of August, 1899. But this time, he came off second best when he was fired at and struck in the arm. A posse of men found him lying on the ground badly injured, and he was taken to Trinidad in Colorado, where he received treatment, but his arm could not be saved, and it was amputated. He was then arrested and put on trial in Clayton, New Mexico, and received the death penalty. He was executed on the 26th of April, 1901. It was said that after committing a robbery, though, he would often bury his ill-gotten gains. But the fact is, to this day, no one knows exactly where they are. Number 9. Ugolino and Vedino Vivaldi were 2 brothers who in the 13th century had a penchant for exploration, and their last effort at finding India has cemented their place in the history of mysterious disappearances. The pair hailed from Italy, and at the time, that city was facing a problem since the land routes that were being used in the Indian spice trade had been sacked by Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil, and hence they'd become unusable. A new route needed to be established so that trade could continue, or the area would face a serious economic crisis. The Vivaldi brothers seemed like the perfect fit, since their family was known as well-versed sailors and they'd become excellent navigators. They managed to secure funds for a seafaring expedition from merchants in the city, and it was decided that they would navigate around the southern tip of Africa in hopes of reaching India. No one had attempted this before, but the brothers were certain that they would be successful. Once they've gathered about 150 men and all the supplies they needed, they set sail from Genoa in May of 1291. The expedition was made up of 2 galleons, which according to some sources were sent to the San Antonio and Alegranza, respectively. Though this has been disputed by some historians, but they're known to have sailed to Majorca, Barcelona, Almeria, and Valencia among others before arriving in South Africa, and they then made their way across the Strait of Ceuta, which is now the Strait of Gibraltar, before slowly making their way down the African coast towards the tip. The journey had gone perfectly to plan up to this point, but what happened next is an event that remains shrouded in mystery to this day. It's certain that the ships passed through an area called Gazora, which is situated close to Cape Juby in Morocco, but no further sightings of the expedition were ever reported. When news of the disappearance of these two explorers reached Italy, people started to speculate as to what could have happened to them, and many theories were put forward, while others believed that they would return someday. Galvano Fiamma, a Dominican friar, would write that in 1340, an Ethiopian embassy that had traveled to Genoa came across a group of Genoese men who'd remained in Ethiopia, and they stated that they were part of an expedition that had become lost. They were too afraid to take on the journey back to Italy, and so they chose to remain in Ethiopia indefinitely. Historians found more possible mentions of the expedition in the Book of Knowledge, the author of which remains unknown. In its pages, it's written that a group of sailors who'd survived a shipwreck were rescued and taken to an area that's believed to be in Ethiopia. The author of the book would recount that while he was in now Mogadishu, he met a Genoese man with the name Sor Leon, who stated that he was in search of his father. It was noted that Ugolino's son, whose name was Sor, had traveled around looking for his father, and it's believed that he made it at least as far as Mogadishu. Number 8. Salem in Massachusetts is infamous for the Salem witch trials that took place there in 1692 and 93. But it was also the location of a mystery that's remained unsolved for centuries, and the truth of the matter will likely never be discovered. It involves a woman named Ellen Carolyn Brown, known to her friends and family as Carrie. She was a great friend of William Shakespeare's work and is said to have been able to recite many of his writings by heart. But she also gained a bad reputation when she started drinking heavily, and before long she became dependent on alcohol. The problem was that she usually didn't have much money to buy alcohol, and so she resorted to becoming a street worker. Hence, she spent many short stints in jail, mostly at Blackwell's Island, but whenever she was released, she would return to the Fourth Ward Saloon where she plied her trade. Having spent most of her money on drinks most nights, she resorted to sleeping in doss houses that would ask a small fee for a place to sleep. But her life hadn't always been so tumultuous. Carrie originally hailed from England and immigrated to the US with her parents while she was still young. They settled in Brooklyn, New York, where she and a sailor called Charles Brown started a relationship. They eventually got married and then relocated to a house on Beckett Street in Salem, since Charles had close familial ties to the area. She would often be left alone in Salem while Charles was away at sea, but his family helped take care of her, and by all accounts, she was happy. She attended church regularly, and through her work with the church, soon gained the respect of its other parishioners. She would eventually give birth to 2 daughters, but after 10 years of marriage, she suddenly started drinking, and her demeanor changed. It's said that she became a mean drunk who would take her frustrations out on Charles and their children. Unsurprisingly, the marriage soon fell apart, but not before the whole family had moved back to New York. The children were taken back to Salem, where they were raised by Charles's family, and soon after, he lost his life while sailing on the coast of Africa. This left Carrie destitute, and she tried to start a career as an actress, during which time she studied Shakespeare. But due to her drinking habit, she only appeared in a handful of plays before she had to resort to street work, and this would prove to be her undoing. At around 11 a.m. on the 23rd of April, 1891, she visited the East River Hotel in Manhattan, where she was supposed to meet a client who was described as 32 years old, 5 foot 8 inches tall, and with a slim build and light mustache. Staff at the hotel believed him to be German and added that he was wearing a dark coat with black pants and a black derby hat. The following morning, Carrie was found deceased in the rented room, having been attacked with a blade, and her injuries were horrendous. An Algerian man named Amir Ben was arrested for the crime and spent 11 years in prison before it was discovered that he was innocent and he was released. The mysterious man with whom Carrie entered that hotel that night was never identified, and her case was never solved. Number 7. In 1968, Geraldo Vidal was a well-known attorney in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and he was married to a woman called Raffo. In May of that year, they were invited to a family gathering in Cheskomas, about 75 miles away, and since it would only be a short drive there, they decided to attend. The exact date isn't known, but one night in May, they set out from their house at around midnight. They headed to Maipu first, where they intended to visit a few of their friends. To get there, they had to take Highway number 2, and they ended up driving behind another couple that was also heading to Maipu to visit relatives. The couple in the other car reached their destination without any issues, but Geraldo and Raffo never arrived, causing their friends some concern. The other couple decided to drive back the way they came in search of the pair, but they found no trace of them. It would only be 2 days later that their friends got word from Geraldo and Raffo, who contacted them via the Argentinian embassy in Mexico City. This left their friends baffled, since Mexico City is 4,000 miles away, and it was arranged for the couple to be picked up from Ezeiza Airport in Buenos Aires. Upon their arrival, Raffo was in such a state of anxiety that she had to be taken to a local clinic, and it was then that Geraldo recounted their strange experience while on the road that night. He stated that just before reaching Cheskomas, they suddenly became aware of a dense fog that had settled in front of their car. They were baffled since the weather had been fine up to that point, but moments later, their vehicle was engulfed by the mist. They believed that they then lost consciousness because, in what seemed like mere moments, they both woke up feeling confused and unsteady. They both felt as though they'd been sleeping for hours, but this couldn't have possibly been the case, since they'd been driving just moments earlier. They realized that they both had pain in the back of their necks, but otherwise they were unharmed. They got out of the car and realized they had no idea where they were. They didn't recognize the road they were parked on, and when Geraldo checked the car, he found that it was covered in strange torch marks as if they'd driven through a fire. They were clearly lost and decided to drive down the road to ask someone for directions. After just a few minutes, they came across a few pedestrians, but they could barely understand them due to their thick accents. This was all explained when they were told that they were now in Mexico, and the couple was understandably left in a state of shock since they had no memory of what happened that night or how they got to Mexico, which should have been an impossibility. It's then that they traveled to the Argentinian embassy in New Mexico, from where they contacted their friends back in Argentina. They calculated that they'd lost their memories of at least 58 hours, during which time they were reported as missing. Their car was impounded and never returned after it was sent to the US, but when they landed in Argentina, they were presented with a brand new car of the same make and model, though it remains unknown where that vehicle came from. No explanation has ever been found, and this case of what many people consider to be teleportation remains a perplexing mystery that will likely never be solved. Number 6. Lynn Burdick spent her childhood growing up in Florida, Massachusetts, a small town very close to the border of Vermont. Her parents, Rufus and Dorothy, had 3 other children, but Lynn was the youngest in a very welcoming home that would often be filled with other family members. The house was known to their extended family as a place where they could find help if it was ever needed, but by the time her siblings had moved out, Lynn was sharing the home with not only her parents, but also her uncle, aunt, and 2 cousins. She often babysat while the adults were out, a role that she truly enjoyed. And when her mother became ill while Lynn was in high school, she spent a lot of time looking after her and making sure she had everything she needed. This didn't affect her studies at all, as she made the honor roll in her senior year, but once she graduated, she found herself stuck as she didn't have enough money to attend college, where she hoped to pursue her dream of becoming a cartoonist. She started working at the Barefoot Peddler, now called the Berkshire Eagle, in 1982 after she turned 18, and usually worked the night shift. The money that she made from that job was mostly saved so that she could go to college one day, but she did use some of it to buy a prom dress. On the 17th of April that year, she was dropped off at work by her brother Brian, as she was working the 4 p.m. to 9 p.m. shift, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Her parents called the store about 40 minutes after she was dropped off to ask if she would need a ride home after her shift, but got no answer. Brian went back to the store to investigate, but he found no sign of her other than her book, which was open on the counter, and an open bottle of soda that she'd been drinking. When the police were called, They found that $180 was missing from the register, and the rest of Lynn's possessions were nowhere to be seen. A search was started the next morning by more than 120 people, but Lynn was never found. It was noted that several women had been kidnapped before their lives were ended in the area over the past decade or so, but it remains unknown whether these cases are related. No further clues were ever found, and the Berkshire State Police Detective Unit has urged anyone with information on Lynn's whereabouts to contact them at 413-499-1112. Number 5. In 1838, Eliza Grimwood was living in Lambeth, London, where she made ends meet as a street worker. Every night she would travel from Lambeth to the West End, where wealthy theater-goers spent a lot of their time, and each night she would choose a different theater in hopes of finding a client. On the 26th of May that year, she was loitering outside the Strand Theater, which was known to attract particularly wealthy people, and there she made contact with a man who spoke with a French accent. After talking for a while, they hailed a taxi and left together. The cab driver would later report that the man in her company was well-spoken, well-dressed, and seemed very polite. He dropped the pair off at number 12 Wellington Terrace, Eliza's address, just after midnight, as was confirmed by her servant who opened the door when they arrived. But she would add that the man seemed to do his best to hide his face from her, but she didn't think much of it at the time. Eliza told her to retire for the night, and she went home. It should be noted that several other people in the house, including a fellow street worker named Mary Glover, a commercial traveler named William Best, and Eliza's cousin, William Hubbard, were there that night. Hubbard and Eliza were known to be in a relationship, and he often became jealous of the men that she brought home. No one present in the house that night heard anything untoward, but the next morning they were shocked by what they found. When Hubbard went looking for her at around 6 a.m., he found Eliza deceased on the floor of the ground floor bedroom. She'd been viciously attacked with a blade, and the man she was seen with was nowhere to be found. Strangely, a purse full of money had been stolen, but Eliza's jewelry was still in her room, as was some money that had been left on her nightstand. The police decided that her attacker was either the man she was with that night, or the jealous Hubbard. Hubbard would claim that while calling for assistance in the house that morning, he saw a man outside the house who immediately offered to help, and he found this suspicious. One officer would also report that he saw Hubbard take the money from the nightstand. It was known that when he was married, he'd been abusive towards her, and eventually threw her out of the house, and he became the main suspect. The Frenchman, with whom she was seen with that night, would later contact the police by anonymous letter, stating that Hubbard had lost his temper that night and ordered him to leave the house after becoming very aggressive towards him. William was taken into custody, but he was released soon after since no biological material was found on any of his clothes, which, given the state of the crime scene, would have been impossible if he were the culprit. In the years that followed, more than one person would claim that they were the attacker, but it was discovered that one was trying to get out of his military service, while another was already incarcerated, and their claims were not taken seriously. No other suspects were ever identified, and Eliza's case remained unsolved for more than a century. Number 4. 21-year-old Richard Cox originally hailed from Mansfield, Ohio, where he did very well at school. He was voted in as class president as a sophomore, and as a senior, he became a member of the National High School Honor Society. Following this, he signed up for military service, and he would reach the rank of sergeant. In 1948, he was sent to West Point Academy in New York, where he excelled as a cadet, and he told his fellow cadets that as soon as he made it back to Ohio, he planned to ask his girlfriend Betty Thomas to marry him. He seemed to have his life all planned out, which makes what happened next all the more perplexing. On the 7th of January 1950, a phone call was received by Peter Haynes, one of Richard's fellow cadets. The man on the other line said his name was George, and he rudely and impatiently asked to speak to Richard, who was not present at the time. The man asked Haynes to deliver a message in which he told Richard to meet him at a hotel for a meal. He added that he and Richard met in Germany, and that he would know who George was. Richard met up with George at Grant Hall, and he would tell the other cadets that they decided to skip dinner and drink whiskey in George's car instead. Richard failed to show up for dinner at the academy that night, though he doctored his time log to make it seem as though he was there. If he'd been out, he would have been immediately expelled, and it seems like a great risk to take just to have a few drinks with someone that he had never mentioned before. The two men saw each other again the next day, and Richard would confirm that they met in Germany, but he found him abrasive and morbid and hoped that their second visit would be the last. But this was not the case, as George showed up at the academy again at 6:18 p.m. on the 14th of January. Richard decided to leave with him, stating that he'd be back around 9:30, but he was never seen or heard from again. What followed became the biggest search operation that West Point had ever seen at that time. Every single building on the site was searched with a fine-toothed comb, and the trails on the area were thoroughly searched by his fellow cadets, but they failed to find any sign of Richard. A nearby pond was completely drained, and Lusk Reservoir was dragged with no positive results. When no progress could be made in the case due to a lack of clues, the Academy contacted the FBI, who joined the investigation in hopes that fresh eyes would find something that had been overlooked. The director of the FBI at that time, J. Edgar Hoover, instructed agents to take the case very seriously, and that any information that was received was immediately followed up on. These orders were followed implicitly, but none of the leads that were received ever led anywhere. For the next 7 years, not a single clue was found to indicate what had happened to Richard, and on the 14th of January, 1957, he was declared legally deceased. A book was written about the case by a retired schoolteacher named Marshall Jacobs, who'd taken a keen interest in Richard's fate. He scoured all the files that had been compiled during the original investigation and re-interviewed everyone involved, including Richard's fellow cadets, his family, and the agents who'd worked on his case. He eventually decided the main suspect was a man named David Westervelt. Jacobs learned that he and Richard met while in Germany, and that at the time, Westervelt went by the name George. He also found out that Westervelt had possibly worked as a CIA recruiter at one point, and thus he came up with the theory to explain where Richards disappeared to. He felt that after it was discovered that he had doctored his time card, he was threatened with expulsion from the academy, and rather go through that ordeal, he decided to take George up on an offer of becoming a secret CIA operative. Number 3. It's been speculated that 31-year-old Harriet Buswell was a victim of a serial killer operating in London, and some have speculated that she may have been the first ever victim of Jack the Ripper, though that theory hasn't gained much traction since his crimes were committed years after Harriet's life was ended. Harriet was living in Great Coram Street, Bloomsbury, London, in 1872, but she was known to her customers as Clara Burton. She likely used a fake name to hide the fact that she was a street worker, and as was the norm in those days, she would hang around theaters in the area in search of customers. But she also loved the theater for another reason. She always hoped to make it as an actress, and at times she saw some success, as she'd appeared in a few plays at the Alhambra Theater, but the small roles that she landed just didn't pay enough for her to get by. She had to pay rent, buy food for her and her daughter, and had to provide her with everything else she needed, and hence she turned to street work and made most of her money in the West End. Whenever she met a client, she would take them back to her room at Great Coram Street, and they would leave again the following morning. On the 24th of December, 1872, Harriet was short on cash, and unable to travel to the West End, borrowed a shilling from her neighbor, promising to pay it back the next day. She then set out to Alhambra Theater as usual, and it's known that she traveled to either Regent Circus or Piccadilly Circus, where she waited for an omnibus, which was a large horse-drawn carriage that was used for public transport. It's believed that before she reached the theater, she met a man who was later described as German, and the pair went back to her room, arriving there between midnight and 1 a.m. While the man was there, Harriet paid the 10 shillings in outstanding rent, and she then went upstairs to her room, where she met an untimely demise. Other people living in the building would tell the police that they heard heavy footsteps in Harriet's room at around 6:30 p.m. the next morning, which was Christmas Day. The footsteps were also heard on the stairs, but no one took much notice since they assumed the German man was in a hurry to leave. But when Harriet hadn't emerged from her room by noon, They became concerned and decided to check on her, but found the door to her room locked. Her landlady unlocked it, and inside they found Harriet deceased, having been attacked with a sharp blade. It was determined that the door had been locked from the outside, and whoever did so left with the key. A hand and thumbprint were found on her body, and it was discovered that some of Harriet's possessions were missing, including her purse and jewelry, which wasn't of much value. A ship's chaplain, Dr. Henry Hessel, was identified as Harriet's client that night, and a chambermaid told the police he'd asked her to wash a few of his handkerchiefs that were stained with biological material. He was charged with the crime, but when it came to light that he was ill in Ramsgate on the night in question, he was released. No one else was ever identified as a suspect, and Harriet's attacker was never caught. Number 2. Australia is known for its dangerous wildlife and uninhabited areas that can prove to be very dangerous should one lose their bearings. But one area has left people terrified since the 1940s, as the sounds that are heard there have never been fully explained. According to most accounts, it all started when an unnamed man started working at Ruthven Station in Queensland. He and his wife didn't have anywhere permanent to live at the time, and so he found a spot close to Wilga Waterhole, where he erected a slab and wooden hut. It should be noted that she was very down to earth, a practical woman who was no stranger to living in isolation, since she spent much of her time living in the outback. While he was at work every day, she would do chores around the hut and get dinner ready for when he returned from his shift. For the first few weeks, everything went well, but one night, all of that changed. The man had finished his shift and was about to leave for home when he was delayed, though it isn't known by what. He arrived home much later than usual, and there he was shocked to find his wife in a state of hysterics. It took some time for him to calm her down, and when he finally did, her explanation left him baffled. She explained that while he was busy in the hut, she started hearing awful shrieking noises that sent a chill down her spine. She was immediately terrified but decided to investigate, and to her surprise, discovered that the sounds were coming from the waterhole. To make matters worse, the man had been given an assignment that would take at least 2 days to complete, which meant that she'd be alone in the hut for that time. He was concerned for her well-being, but had no choice but to complete his task, and 2 days later, he rushed home. This time, he found her in an even worse state than before. She stated that the wailing and screeching had happened each night, and that the sounds had grown so loud that she thought she would go insane out of fear. In an effort to get to the bottom of the mystery, the couple decided to camp out next to the waterhole one night, but they only lasted a short while, as the shrieks got so intense that they decided to pack up their things and leave. In the years that followed, the hole gained a reputation for being either haunted or housing some unearthly creature that was never seen. And soon, legends grew out of the ordeal, as people started suggesting that a traveler fell down the hole one day, and that it was his spirit that was calling out to be rescued. Number 1. Donald Fraser, who in 1933 was the owner of the Racehorse Hotel in Christchurch, New Zealand, was by no means your average hotel owner. According to most people who stayed over there, he seemed annoyed by their presence, and those close to him knew him to have a bad temper that would often cause him to become violent. One of his previous jobs on the railway came to an end after his bosses received complaints that he was a violent bully, and he then started working in drapery. This meant that he never stayed in the same location for very long, but in 1927, he grew tired of the trade and decided to buy the hotel. He quickly became a wealthy man who owned a thoroughbred horse, and while his reputation wasn't the best, the hotel saw a lot of guests passing through. But anyone who caused a scene or argued with Donald was summarily thrown out of the building, often with a few bruises to show for it. He was married to a woman named Elizabeth for 18 years by 1933, and she enjoyed living a life of luxury. They had 2 children who received the best education. By all accounts, his family didn't want for anything, thanks to Donald's success as a hotelier. On the 17th of November that year, their lives would be changed forever. The previous night, Donald hosted a party at the hotel. All establishments were supposed to close at 6 p.m. back then, but guests at the hotel would keep drinking after the doors were locked, as the police usually turned a blind eye. Donald is said to have become extremely inebriated that night, and he had to be carried to his room. He and Elizabeth retired to their room, but according to witnesses, they heard the sound of a firearm being discharged about an hour later, and this was followed by Elizabeth's screams as she came running out of the room, and the rest of the family and the guests in the building rushed over to investigate. Elizabeth told them that Donald had been attacked with a firearm, and upon investigation, he was found deceased on the couple's bed. The police were called, and the hotel became abuzz with officers from different areas of Christchurch. Guests at the hotel were questioned, as were the horse trainers, but no one had seen a fleeing assailant. Anyone who owned the type of weapon used in the attack was tracked down and questioned, but they were all ruled out as suspects. The resulting investigation became the biggest in the area's history at the time, and 2 specialist detectives were brought in when the case stalled. They noted that while Elizabeth was seen to be distraught on that night, she seemed somewhat nonplussed over Donald's demise in the days and weeks that followed, which they found very suspicious. It would then come to light that she also was disliked by people living in the area, and one family member remained adamant that she was the culprit, and he would not be convinced otherwise. But since Elizabeth had little to no experience with firearms, and the weapon that was used was never found, she was ruled out as a suspect, despite standing to gain a fortune in inheritance. It's said that at Donald's funeral, she was overheard telling someone that the weapon was at the bottom of the ocean and would never be found. But this was never confirmed, and the case was never solved. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.